I thought I owned the room, until one invitation turned the night against me. I still remember that night as if it were captured in glass, shimmering and untouchable. The kind of evening that makes you believe you've finally stepped into the life you once only admired from magazine covers. My name is Victoria Hamilton, 27 years old, senior vice president at one of Manhattan's most prestigious consulting firms, and at that moment, the view from my penthouse window felt like proof that I had truly arrived. The city stretched beneath me like a sea of liquid light, and I stood at its summit, the world humming quietly at my feet. Every detail of that evening had been choreographed with meticulous precision, the kind of perfection that isn't stumbled upon but built, layer by careful layer, until not even the air seems capable of imperfection. It was my domain, my rules, my guest list, my celebration of what I'd built with my own sharp hands. The chandeliers above us scattered light like falling diamonds, and the tall windows reflected back a woman who looked every inch the part she had worked so ruthlessly to play. The satin emerald dress that curved across my shoulders was tailored in Milan, the diamond necklace a self-purchased trophy for closing the Peterson deal, a silent reminder that I no longer needed anyone to reward me. Every element of the night was curated. The scent of white roses arranged across marble tables, the sound of soft jazz melting between conversations, the taste of imported champagne that fizzed with subtle arrogance. When I looked around the room, I didn't see guests. I saw investments, future partners, ladders already leaning toward my next promotion. I moved among them with a grace I had rehearsed in mirrors, that easy smile designed to feel natural, but measured enough to remind everyone that proximity to me was a privilege they should earn. To the casual observer, I was charming. To myself, I was strategic. Every conversation, every compliment, every laugh was a coin in the vault of my advancement. In Manhattan's financial circles, relationships were currency, and I had learned early that warmth, like wealth, only mattered when it was properly leveraged. Yet beneath the polite laughter and clinking glasses, there was a quiet truth I would never have admitted aloud, a thin layer of contempt coating everything I touched. I had built an invisible wall between the people who belonged to my world and those who served it. It wasn't malice, it was logic, or so I told myself. People like me were the curators, the creators, the ones who sculpted elegance from effort. The others, the drivers, the caterers, the cleaners, the maintenance staff, they were background texture. Necessary, polite, but forgettable. That certainty cracked for the first time when James Morrison, one of the firm's senior partners, began to speak. James was the kind of man whose approval still carried weight, even in rooms filled with power. His glass of brandy caught the light as he remarked casually about the maintenance fellow fixing the elevator earlier that week. The table laughed lightly, the kind of laughter that fills a silence before it can become awkward, and I felt the instinctive flicker of superiority spark within me. "Oh, Marcus," I said, recognizing the name immediately. "Yes, I know him. Polite enough, always working quietly with his toolbox, sweet, but not exactly the kind you'd expect to see at a gathering like this." The small circle around me laughed, not cruelly but compliantly, the way people laugh when they know the rules of belonging. My voice was smooth, my tone practiced, but even as I said it, I felt the thrill of control, that intoxicating sense of being the axis around which attention turned. Margaret Thornfield, the banker's wife with a taste for gossip, added playfully, "The poor man would probably faint if he walked into a room like this." The laughter swelled again, gentle but smug, and in that moment I realized how completely I had their attention. That was when the idea came. Spontaneous, reckless, and perfectly aligned with the brand of daring that people expected from me. Why not turn the moment into an experiment, a statement about generosity wrapped in irony? I had built a reputation for doing unexpected things, for taking risks that others only whispered about. What better way to demonstrate confidence and charm than to invite someone like Marcus into a world he could never truly belong to. It would amuse my guests, create conversation, and maybe even position me as someone with progressive sensibilities. The thought lit up my mind like champagne bubbles rising too quickly to the surface. Before anyone could second-guess me, I reached for my phone, already imagining the surprised expression on his face when he received the message. His number was stored in the building directory for maintenance requests, and I typed with deliberate casualness. "Marcus, this is Victoria Hamilton from the Penthouse. I'm hosting a small gathering tonight and thought you might enjoy joining us. Nothing too formal, just good company and conversation. Hope to see you, Victoria." My thumb hovered for only a heartbeat before pressing send. Around me, the conversation hushed with fascination, a mixture of admiration and disbelief. "You didn't," Margaret whispered, her eyes wide. I smiled, feeling the familiar spark of satisfaction that came from being just bold enough to unsettle. "I did," I replied lightly. "Let's see how the other half handles our world for a change." The reply came almost immediately, the vibration of my phone slicing through the low music. I looked down, expecting a polite refusal or confusion. Instead, his message read, "Thank you for the invitation, Miss Hamilton. I would be honored to attend. May I bring my daughter?" For a moment, I blinked, absorbing the unexpected detail. A daughter? Hadn't known that. The idea intrigued me, made the experiment even more interesting. "Of course," I typed back. "Looking forward to meeting her." I turned to my guests, lifting my glass as if I'd just made a philanthropic gesture instead of a mockery. "He's coming," I announced with a grin. "And he's bringing his little girl." The murmurs that followed were a mix of amusement and discomfort, but none of that mattered. The story was already in motion. I felt invincible, unaware that the decision I made out of arrogance and curiosity would soon dismantle everything I believed about power, class, and the people I thought I understood. I don't know it yet, but I've just invited the one man who can read this entire room better than I can. I meant it as a joke, but the punchline was waiting at my front door. The news of Marcus's acceptance spread across my living room like a ripple through still water. Subtle at first, then gathering quiet momentum as every face turned toward me, waiting for my reaction. I remember the faint tightening of my smile as I lifted my glass and announced, half teasing, half triumphant, "He's bringing his daughter, how charming." My tone was light, musical even, but underneath it lingered a condescension so effortless I barely noticed it myself. Around me, the small circle of New York's polished elite responded with the kind of social choreography we had all mastered. Polite laughter, raised brows, a few indulgent nods that said only Victoria could think of something like this. Margaret Thornfield, forever the voice of disapproval disguised as concern, leaned toward me and whispered, "Darling, are you quite sure that's wise? He'll feel completely out of place." I smiled, the way a cat might smile before it plays with its prey, and replied, "Margaret, I think it's time we broke a few barriers, don't you? Besides, it will be good for him to see a different world for once." The men chuckled. The women exchanged faint smirks, and I felt that heady rush of power that came from being both admired and slightly feared. Even their unease was a kind of applause. It confirmed that I, and not they, had the courage to cross a line simply for the thrill of it. There was something intoxicating about the idea that my simple invitation could stir so much conversation. I told myself it was harmless, even noble in its own way, a small gesture of inclusion that I could later spin into a story about empathy and equality when I needed to soften my reputation. The truth was far less flattering. I wanted entertainment. I wanted to see what happened when someone from a world built on calloused hands and hourly wages stepped into mine. A world where status was oxygen and perception was everything. It wasn't cruelty, it was curiosity sharpened by ego. As the evening deepened, the champagne flowed more freely, and the idea of Marcus's impending arrival became part of the night's unspoken agenda. I caught snippets of conversation drifting around me, light jokes about etiquette, whispered bets on how long he would stay, a few condescending remarks about what he might wear. The laughter was smooth, cultured, never loud enough to break decorum, but the cruelty lived in the undertones. I could feel it, and instead of silencing it, I encouraged it by pretending not to notice. Because in my mind, this was theater, and every good performance needed an audience willing to play along. Still, beneath my poise, there was a strange, inexplicable excitement that pulsed in the quiet corners of my chest. Perhaps it was anticipation, or maybe just vanity, the kind that comes from knowing you control a moment that everyone else is waiting to witness. I imagined the scene unfolding with cinematic precision. Marcus stepping into the penthouse, slightly nervous but grateful, his daughter clinging shyly to his hand as they stared wide-eyed at the chandeliers, the art, the people dressed in fabrics worth more than their month's rent. I pictured myself gliding over, kind and gracious, making him feel welcome just enough to draw praise for my generosity. "Victoria has such a big heart," they'd say later. "How extraordinary that she treats everyone the same." That was the narrative I rehearsed in my mind, one flattering enough to justify the joke. It was my own small illusion of power, the ability to manipulate not only how people behaved, but how they would remember me afterward. I could already hear the applause in my head, the story I'd tell at brunches and board meetings, the moral I'd claim about understanding all walks of life. I believed it completely because believing it allowed me to ignore the uglier truth, that I was still the girl desperate to be seen as extraordinary, even if it meant humiliating someone else to prove it. When the doorman's voice came through the intercom, calm and professional, "Miss Hamilton, your visitors have arrived." My pulse quickened. The moment I had so carelessly engineered was here. "Send them up," I said, my voice steady, controlled, the way one speaks before stepping onto a stage. I turned back toward the party, surveying the scene like a director making final adjustments before the curtain rises. The music softened, conversation slowed, and without anyone needing to say a word, people subtly repositioned themselves, angling for a view of the entrance. It was human nature. Everyone pretended indifference, but curiosity flickered in every perfectly made-up face. I moved to the grand mirror near the entrance and studied my reflection one last time. My emerald gown caught the light with every breath I took. My hair was smooth, my skin flawless, my smile composed yet inviting. I told myself that this too was part of leadership: grace under scrutiny, elegance under pressure. In truth, I wasn't preparing to greet a guest. I was preparing to perform a version of myself that fit the role I had written in my head. I could hear the elevator beginning its ascent, the soft mechanical hum that seemed suddenly louder than the music. My guests pretended to continue their conversations, but the energy in the room shifted, tightening like a held breath. I walked toward the door, the heels of my shoes clicking rhythmically against the marble floor, every step deliberate, rehearsed, confident. My heart, however, was anything but calm. For the first time that night, an unfamiliar unease stirred beneath my pride, a faint whisper I couldn't name, warning that something about this evening was already spiraling beyond my control. Still, I dismissed it. Control was what I did best. I straightened my shoulders, lifted my chin, and positioned myself by the entrance as the elevator slowed to a stop. Somewhere behind me, glasses clinked. Someone laughed too loudly, and the music paused just enough to make the silence feel heavy. I smiled, ready to meet my experiment, ready to prove that I could play the benevolent host to perfection. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime that echoed like the opening note of a symphony. I inhaled, prepared for the scene I had imagined: the nervous worker, the shy child, the polite gratitude that would reaffirm the hierarchy I had so carefully built. But what stepped out of that elevator wasn't the story I had written in my mind. It was something else entirely. something that would change the room, and me forever. The elevator chimes, and the script I wrote in my head goes up in smoke. The man I invited to be a prop walked in like he owned the stage. The soft chime of the elevator carried through the hall like a bell announcing judgment. The chatter in my penthouse faded into a brittle quiet, the kind of silence that stretches between people who sense that something unscripted is about to happen. I smoothed the silk of my dress once more, rehearsing the warm, performative smile I had planned. I expected a nervous man in work boots and a wrinkled shirt, clutching his daughter's hand as though it were a lifeline, eyes darting from chandelier to champagne glass in wide-eyed disbelief. I had imagined the awkwardness, the pity disguised as politeness, the small victory I would feel by offering him a glimpse of a world he could never truly inhabit. But when the door finally opened, the air shifted in a way that no one in the room could ignore. The man standing before me bore no resemblance to the maintenance worker I had met in passing. No trace of the quiet, apologetic man who once knelt by the elevator panel with tools scattered at his side. Marcus stood there in an immaculate charcoal gray suit, the kind of cut that spoke not of department stores or rental racks, but of custom measurements and European tailoring. The fabric caught the light with subtle sheen, fluid yet precise, moving like it had memorized the rhythm of his body. His shirt was crisp, the collar perfect, the kind of detail only wealth or refinement can command. His shoes, polished to mirror-like perfection, gleamed against the marble, and on his wrist rested a timepiece I recognized instantly, though I wished I hadn't. A Patek Philippe, understated but unmistakably expensive. In that instant, something inside me lurched. My mind, desperate to maintain order, tried to assign logic to the sight. Perhaps he'd borrowed the suit. Perhaps some miracle of lighting was exaggerating what I saw. But no, there was no mistaking the confidence that radiated from him. Marcus wasn't pretending to belong. He simply did. And then there was the girl. 6 years old, maybe 7, standing half a step behind her father. Emily. Her dark hair framed her face in soft, perfect curls, styled in a way that no hurried parent could have achieved without help. The child's dress was something out of an expensive catalog. Pale blue silk with intricate stitching and tiny pearl buttons, each one catching the light like morning dew. She wore small pearl earrings that matched them, and her patent Mary Janes gleamed as though she'd stepped out of a display window. But more striking than any of that was the way she carried herself. With poise, with awareness, as though she had been raised not just in comfort, but in command of social grace far beyond her years. "Good evening, Miss Hamilton," Marcus said, his voice deep but smooth, warm enough to disarm and confident enough to unsettle. "Thank you so much for inviting us." His tone wasn't the timid gratitude I'd anticipated. It was self-assured, measured, a man acknowledging an equal, not thanking a superior. He turned slightly, placing a gentle hand on his daughter's shoulder. "This is my daughter, Emily." The little girl stepped forward, her eyes meeting mine with the calm assurance of someone taught to meet the world without flinching. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Hamilton," she said softly, then added with a small, graceful curtsy that belonged in a royal drawing room, "Daddy has told me wonderful things about you." For a moment, my rehearsed words died somewhere in my throat. The room seemed to tilt slightly, and I became acutely aware of the weight of my own silence. I managed a faint, uncertain smile, stepping back to let them in, though I felt as if I were the guest in my own home. The crowd turned as they entered, curiosity and quiet disbelief washing through them like an electric current. The murmurs that followed were small and brittle, fading as quickly as they rose. Every head turned, every conversation stopped. Then came the moment that sealed it. A delicate crash, the sharp sound of glass shattering against marble. Margaret Thornfield had dropped her champagne flute, her painted mouth parted in wordless astonishment as bubbles and crystal fragments spread at her feet. Beside her, James Morrison, the man whose offhand remark had started this entire charade, stood utterly motionless. His face had gone pale, his knuckles white around the stem of his drink. There was something like recognition in his eyes, a dawning horror that sent a cold pulse through the air. Marcus, however, remained composed, almost amused by the stillness that followed him. "Good evening, everyone," he said, projecting his voice just enough to fill the room without force. "I hope we're not interrupting anything important." His gaze swept across the room, not defensive, not uncertain, but comfortably authoritative, the way a seasoned host surveys his guests. Emily stayed close to him, her small hand brushing against the side of his tailored jacket, but even she didn't look afraid. She was observant, curious, her expression intelligent in a way that made her seem older than she was. "Marcus," James Morrison finally said, voice cracking slightly. "Marcus Thompson." The name landed in the silence like a dropped stone. My pulse stumbled. "Thompson?" The recognition in James's tone made the name sound heavier, more significant than I could understand. Marcus's lips curved into a polite smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hello, James. It's been some time." My mind grasped for context, but I could barely think. The Marcus I knew, if I had ever truly known him, was a man who repaired elevators and changed light bulbs. The Marcus standing in front of me was someone else entirely, someone who commanded the attention of everyone in that room without even trying. His daughter moved gracefully through the silence, greeting the stunned adults with perfect manners, remembering each name after a single introduction. The child of a man who fixed my plumbing shouldn't have known how to carry herself like this. And yet here she was, poised, composed, untouchable. When Emily reached me again, she looked up with curious admiration. "Miss Hamilton," she said sweetly, her tone bright and pure, "your home is beautiful. Is that a real Monet above the fireplace?" Her question hit me like a spark, both innocent and cutting. I nodded mutely, the practiced charm gone from my voice. "Yes," I managed, my throat dry. The room seemed to breathe again, slowly, cautiously, as though afraid of shattering another glass. People began to speak, to laugh softly, to pretend they hadn't just witnessed the unmasking of something far greater than social discomfort. But the illusion of control had already collapsed, and I felt its loss like gravity pulling at my chest. James turned toward me, his voice quiet but trembling as though saying the words made them real. "Marcus. Thompson." One word from him turned my superiority into a mirror. James recovered first, though even his recovery looked like a man trying to catch his balance on a floor that had tilted under him. And the way he said Marcus's name again, softly this time, with the care one uses when addressing a judge rather than an acquaintance, told the entire room that whatever story we had been telling ourselves about who belonged here had just been revised by a hand none of us controlled, because Marcus answered with an easy nod and a greeting that sounded like two peers resuming a conversation interrupted by years rather than status. Their exchange was unhurried and threaded with a familiarity that could not be faked, small references to places and people that lived far from maintenance closets and service corridors, and when someone near the bar, eager to reassert the old script, asked Marcus whether he was enjoying his work in the building, he smiled in a way that gently declined the insult, and said almost lazily that maintenance had become something of a hobby, and the word hung there with a delicate cruelty that didn't need to raise its voice, detonating the hierarchy I had worshipped by revealing it as a game only I believed was still being played. I felt the room tilt again as he moved through it, not like an intruder navigating hostile ground, but like a seasoned host returning to familiar furniture, greeting investors whose names carried weight on more than one continent, pausing by collectors whose opinions could move prices with a shrug, receiving their attention without reaching for it. And every gesture he made, subtle, unforced, economical, whispered that he was not aspiring upward into our air. He had brought his own atmosphere with him, and we were the ones learning how to breathe inside it. When Harold Westbrook, who could appraise a masterpiece in the time it takes most people to exhale, began describing the frenzy at a recent contemporary sale, Marcus joined the conversation not as a braggart, but as a participant who'd earned his footing, mentioning the cadence of the bidding, the jitter in the room when the increments leapt, the angle of strategy when a buyer reveals his ceiling by pretending he doesn't have one. And I watched Harold's expression shift from polite interest to the fixed attention of a specialist, realizing he is speaking to another specialist. Then Marcus mentioned, almost as an afterthought, the Henderson piece that had driven the late-session blood pressure, the steel and river glass construction that seemed to hold light, as if it were a liquid trapped inside its frame. And he said he had chased it farther than he'd intended because some works refused to be treated like assets. And Harold, unable to help himself, blurted the price, nearly $2 million before premiums, a number that snapped several heads around and left a small, reverent silence in its wake, as the arithmetic of who is who rearranged itself behind carefully composed faces. Inside me, a second theater played, a private one, in which the props of my certainty slid off their nails and clattered to the floor, because I could suddenly see every moment I had dismissed as ordinary. The courtesy in his eyes that wasn't submission, but restraint. The way he never looked hurried, even when timing mattered. The quiet watch on his wrist I had mistaken for a nice knockoff because it was understated. The unmarked leather of his shoes that had read as merely polished until I noticed how the stitching curved like handwriting. And I felt the heat of my own bias flushing my skin in a room that had not changed its temperature. I needed air I could claim as mine, so I excused myself with a smile that felt like a mask, and slipped into the kitchen where the caterers moved with a choreography that always impressed me, and I stood there with my palms on the cool edge of the counter, watching through the doorway as Emily perched beside Margaret, not intimidated by the older woman's lacquered poise, speaking with bright composure about her piano teacher and the pieces she loved, about arpeggios that made her fingers feel like birds, and then, as if it were the most natural sentence in the world, mentioning her upcoming recital at Carnegie Hall. The name struck me like a bell, not because I hadn't heard children play there, but because I knew the path to that stage was steep, curated, and guarded by gatekeepers who loved excellence more than money. And I watched Margaret nod with the swallowed envy of a woman who suddenly understood that the small child beside her did not simply inhabit elegance. She had been trained in it, not as vanity, but as fluency, the way one becomes native in a language by speaking it without an accent in rooms that expect perfect grammar. When I returned to the great windows, the city was a spill of lit veins across the black river, the glass cool beneath my fingertips, and Marcus stood a short distance away with his hands in his pockets, not performing for anyone, only looking, the posture of a man who has learned to measure noise against quiet and profit against cost. And when I joined him, ashamed of the smallness thrumming in me, he offered a reflection that felt like the opposite of bragging, saying that views matter because they remind you of scale, that sometimes you have to lift your eyes to keep your heart from shrinking to the size of your schedule. I had expected a conversation about price, square footage and comps, and the choreography of exclusivity. But instead he spoke about the mercy of distance, the way the city softens when you step back, how the same lights that can make a person feel invincible can also make them feel answerable. And in that shift I understood something I wish I had learned younger, which is that power without perspective becomes a costume, beautiful under chandeliers and useless in the dark. Even as he spoke, he tracked Emily with the calm vigilance of a man who has trained himself to divide his attention without fraying it. A small glance when she moved toward the terrace doors, a slight change in his posture when a stranger leaned too close to compliment her earrings, and I realized with an ache that surprised me that what I had invited for spectacle was in fact a family, a father, and a daughter shaped by more than wealth, guarded by something fiercer than status, bound by a grief I could not yet see, and a tenderness I could feel from across the room. I watched him permit her independence in measured lines, granting freedom with invisible borders, the way a careful hand lets a kite catch the wind but keeps the string secure. And in that choreography I saw not a performance for my guests, but the daily liturgy of a parent who knows that safety is not the absence of danger, but the presence of someone who refuses to look away. Around us, the evening recalibrated, conversations resuming with new caution, laughter pitched a shade lower, the falseness of our earlier amusement replaced by the appetite of people who smell a story they will not be able to stop telling. And I knew, as surely as I knew the weight of the diamond at my throat, that the night had turned on an axis I had not anticipated and would not be able to spin back. The guests drifted out in elegant clusters, hungry for explanations I could not give, and as the door closed on the last whisper of perfume, I felt morning already gathering like a verdict, promising a reckoning with the truth I had been too comfortable to see. By 8 a.m., my party had become public property. The morning after my perfect evening felt like waking in the ruins of something I couldn't yet name. The first thing I registered wasn't the light slicing through the curtains, but the sound. My phone vibrating across the glass table like a trapped insect, relentless, insistent. I had barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Marcus standing beneath my chandeliers, that calm power radiating from him like heat. I replayed the moment again and again, as though if I examined it long enough, I could make sense of how a man who fixed light fixtures could so effortlessly command a room full of people who owned the lights themselves. But sense refused to come. The messages began pouring in before sunrise, first polite, then frantic, then hungry. The guests from last night, my colleagues, my acquaintances from the firm, all demanding answers I didn't have. Who was he? How did you know him? Do you have any idea what you've done? Their curiosity was almost violent. Between each new buzz came James Morrison's voicemails, his voice clipped and urgent, stripped of its usual smooth composure. "Victoria, call me back immediately. We need to talk." The words repeated, escalating in tone, until by his fourth message the calm executive was gone, replaced by something closer to fear. By 7, the messages were no longer confined to the people who had been there. My name, my party, my address, everything had begun to spread. I could see it happening on my phone screen in real time. Social posts, whispered speculations, blurry photos of Marcus and Emily entering the elevator. The captions blurred together. Who is the mysterious guest at Victoria Hamilton's penthouse? Anonymous. Billionaire crashes Manhattan elite event. Hidden fortune in plain sight? The attention that had always thrilled me now turned claustrophobic. Every notification another finger tapping on glass. I was still staring at the screen when the doorbell rang. A single chime that made me flinch. For one small, naive second, I hoped it was James. I imagined him walking in with some simple explanation that would make everything small again. Ordinary. Instead, when I checked the monitor, a woman stood in the hallway. Polished, professional, and unmistakably focused. She wore a press badge clipped to her blazer. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity, the same trait that had undone me the night before, won again. When I opened the door, she smiled in that practiced, neutral way journalists do when they already know they have the upper hand. "Miss Hamilton? Jennifer Walsh, New York Chronicle. I was hoping we could talk about last night." The mention of Chronicle alone made my stomach clench. The publication was one of the city's oldest and most influential, equal parts news and social commentary. Their Sunday profile section was both coveted and feared. I stepped aside automatically, every instinct of self-preservation dulled by disbelief. "I'm not sure I can help you," I began carefully. It was just a small gathering. Jennifer's eyes flicked to the half-finished champagne glasses still scattered across the living room. The remains of the empire I had tried to build on image alone. "Yes," she said lightly, "but one of your guests wasn't so small." She tapped her tablet, and in a heartbeat, the screen filled with a photograph that stopped the air in my throat. Marcus. Not in work clothes, not in the muted tones of a quiet man avoiding attention, but in a suit similar to the one he had worn last night, standing behind a podium. Behind him, an enormous screen bore a logo I didn't recognize, sleek lettering reading the Thompson Foundation. The caption beneath the image read, "Marcus Thompson announces expansion of global humanitarian initiatives, 2019. Jennifer watched my face the way a doctor watches a patient receive bad news. "You recognize him, of course." Yes, that's him," I said slowly, my own voice sounding distant to my ears. "But this says foundation." "What kind of foundation?" "The kind," she replied evenly, "that manages $800 million in assets." The number hit me harder than the champagne had the night before. 800 million. The room seemed to sway around me as I stared at the tablet. "That can't be right," I whispered, though I knew instinctively it was. Jennifer swiped again, revealing a series of images. Marcus in conversation with figures I recognized instantly. Philanthropists, government leaders, celebrities known for their causes rather than their scandals. In one photo, he was shaking hands with a UN official. In another, standing beside his wife, a woman whose face glowed with intelligence and kindness. "Dr. Sarah Thompson," the caption read. My throat closed as I took it in. The Thompson Foundation, Jennifer continued, was one of the largest private humanitarian organizations in the country. Education programs, medical research, disaster relief, you name it. But 3 years ago, Marcus Thompson disappeared, walked away from it all. No public appearances, no statements, nothing. Until now. She paused for effect, and I realized she was measuring every one of my reactions, cataloging them for the story she was already writing. Last night, Miss Hamilton, was his first verified public sighting in nearly 3 years. The weight of her words pressed against me, slow and heavy. 3 years. Gone. And I, in my arrogance, had invited him as if he were an amusement. The memory of my smug laughter curdled inside me. "Why would he be working maintenance?" I murmured. "It doesn't make sense." Jennifer's expression softened, just slightly. "That's the question everyone's asking. There were rumors after his wife's death, about grief, about threats, about hidden motives, but no one could prove anything. What I can tell you is that the entire philanthropic world is buzzing this morning. You may have hosted more than a social event, Miss Hamilton. You may have reintroduced a mystery the world has been trying to solve for years." I sank onto the edge of the couch, my legs refusing to hold me. I wanted to rewind the night, to unsend the message, to stop the elevator doors before they opened. But the story had already escaped me. It was no longer mine to control. Jennifer's voice drew me back. "Do you know who Marcus Thompson really is?" she asked quietly. I met her eyes, and felt the truth settle like a stone in my chest. "No," I said finally. "I thought I did." "Do you know who Marcus Thompson really is?" she asks. And I finally admit I don't. He didn't disappear to hide his wealth. He disappeared to protect his world. Jennifer settled opposite me, crossing her legs with a calm that seemed rehearsed, the kind of composure built by years of asking questions that made other people unravel. Her tablet glowed faintly between us, still showing Marcus's picture behind that podium. "You said you didn't really know him," she began, her voice neither accusing nor sympathetic, simply factual. "Then let me fill in the parts most people only speculate about." She swiped the screen again, and a new image appeared. Marcus standing beside a woman whose brilliance seemed to radiate even through pixels. Her name appeared in bold beneath the photo. Dr. Sarah Thompson. "That's his wife," Jennifer explained, or was. She was a pediatric surgeon, but also a research scientist. Brilliant. She was leading trials on a treatment protocol that, according to insiders, would have revolutionized pediatric oncology. A therapy that cut costs, shortened treatment times, and improved survival rates. It would have changed everything. She glanced at me, letting the implications settle before continuing. 3 years ago, she died in a car accident. It was ruled an accident at the time. Slick roads, late at night. But the timing was suspicious. The very week her research was supposed to be published. The words hung heavy between us. I tried to imagine the quiet man I'd seen fixing light bulbs and elevator panels, standing beside a woman like that. Someone capable of saving children's lives. I thought about Emily's calm intelligence, her eloquence, her eyes that seemed older than her 6 years. She wasn't just precocious. She was raised in brilliance. Jennifer leaned forward slightly, her tone shifting from reportorial to speculative. After Sarah's death, Marcus withdrew from everything. The foundation continued its work under trustees, but he disappeared from public life. The last confirmed sighting was at his wife's funeral. Then, nothing. No press, no statements, not even a public record of travel. It was like he evaporated. I stared at the photo again, at the man behind the podium who looked both composed and deeply human. But why maintenance work? I asked quietly. Why here? Jennifer tilted her head, as if she'd been waiting for that question. That's what nobody can explain. Some think it was grief, that he needed distance from the world that took his wife. Others whisper about threats, people who wanted to control or suppress Sarah's research. When that theory circulated, it was dismissed as conspiracy. But after last night, after you, those whispers are back. She swiped through a series of slides, snippets of online chatter, screenshots from financial blogs and social media posts. Each one contained a variation of the same headline. Billionaire philanthropist resurfaces in Manhattan under false identity. The velocity of it made my head spin. How did they find this so fast? I stammered. Because people like Marcus Thompson don't vanish quietly, Jennifer replied. When someone with that kind of influence goes missing, there are entire networks watching, waiting for any trace of him, and you just gave them one. Dozens of outlets are picking it up. International wires, business journals, humanitarian think tanks, it's everywhere. By tonight, there won't be a single corner of the financial world that doesn't know his name again. My chest tightened as the truth began to unfold in slow, cruel clarity. What I had considered a playful act of social daring had become something else entirely. A public unveiling of a man who had chosen, very deliberately, not to be found. "Oh my God," I whispered, pressing my fingers against my temple. "I've exposed him." Jennifer didn't disagree. "You've certainly drawn attention to him," she said. "But don't mistake me, Miss Hamilton. You're not the villain. Here, you couldn't have known. You're just the spark. The first domino." The phrase hit me like a slap. The first domino. I imagined the chain reaction already tumbling outward. Headlines multiplying, phone calls being made, security footage analyzed, curiosity mutating into intrusion. My reputation had always thrived on being talked about, but this was different. This wasn't gossip. It was exposure. And worse, it had consequences for someone who hadn't sought the stage I had so recklessly built around him. Jennifer continued, scrolling through her notes. What makes the story even more fascinating is the paradox of it all. A man of extraordinary wealth, choosing invisibility. Imagine having the resources to live anywhere in the world, and choosing instead to disappear into the background of your own city. It's almost poetic, isn't it? A billionaire living quietly as a worker among those who never noticed him. Her words carried admiration, but I felt only a rising sense of nausea. Poetic? No, it was tragic, because behind that invisibility must have been fear or guilt, or some secret so heavy that wealth couldn't protect him from it. And now, because of me, that fragile anonymity was gone. She set her tablet down, folding her hands. "I need to ask you something." Did he say anything last night? Anything at all? That might suggest why he was there or what he was planning? I shook my head helplessly. No. He was polite, gracious. He didn't seem like a man hiding anything. But then again, maybe that was exactly the point. Jennifer nodded slowly, making a note on her tablet. Understood. If you remember anything, please call me. This story is going to move quickly. And if I were you, I'd brace for the attention. You might not be the story's subject, but you're certainly its setting. After she left, silence returned to the apartment. But it wasn't peace. It was aftermath. The champagne glasses from last night still sparkled under the morning light, but now they looked like evidence, reminders of a vanity I could no longer defend. I sat at the table, my reflection distorted in the marble, and wondered how a single impulsive message could unravel someone's carefully hidden world. The guilt that began as a whisper grew heavier by the minute. I imagined Marcus reading the news, seeing his own face plastered across screens again, feeling the walls close in around the fragile life he'd built for Emily. I had thought myself powerful for inviting him. Now I felt like an accomplice to betrayal. My phone vibrated again. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, but the name flashing on the screen froze me. James Morrison, the man who had started this with a careless remark. I hesitated, then answered. His voice came through low and tense, stripped of pretense. Victoria, he said, we need to talk. Right now. What's happening, James? I'm coming over, he said. There was a pause, and then, so quiet I almost missed it. And bring your courage. James calls with a sentence that chills me. I'm coming over. And bring your courage. My living room turned into an operations room. The knock that followed James's phone call was not the polite, social tap I was used to hearing from caterers and couriers and neighbors asking about noise. It was a measured cadence with purpose behind it, the sound of an arrival that expected to be admitted. And when I opened the door, I found James standing there with his tie askew and a gravity in his eyes I had never seen. And beside him, a woman in a charcoal suit who wore authority the way others wear perfume. Subtle yet unmistakable, her badge produced with a practiced motion as she introduced herself as Agent Sarah Chen, FBI Financial Crimes. And within a heartbeat, my beautiful living room, with its lake of marble, its curated art, its lingering scent of last night's flowers, was no longer a stage for vanity, but a surface upon which maps and timelines and consequences could be spread. They moved with professional economy, declining coffee, declining pleasantries, taking seats that afforded sightlines to the door and the windows, as if my penthouse were merely a larger conference room with better lighting. And James, who has made a career of sounding unruffled in storms, spoke first with an urgency that made the words land like pebbles dropped into a still pond where the ripples never end, telling me that what had been labeled an accident 3 years ago was, in the eyes of people who had kept watch long after the headlines went quiet, an event surrounded by circumstances that refused to behave like chance, and that Sarah Thompson's oncology breakthrough did not merely promise hope and healing. It threatened to redraw the financial map of an industry that counts in billions and measures success in the preservation of margins as much as in the extension of lives. Agent Chen took the thread and wove a stark tapestry with it, explaining that long before the crash, there had been attempts to infiltrate research servers, that private security had flagged unusual access patterns and suspicious inquiries, that a cluster of shell entities had begun circling the licensing rights like vultures disguised as doves, and although none of it rose to the level of proof that prosecutors crave, every piece suggested a pattern of pressure designed to push a miracle into the hands best positioned to monetize it at scale, until one rainy night a car left the road, and a woman who cut suffering from children's bodies with steady hands was silenced, and the official file was closed with a stamp that said, "Accident," while a quieter file, built by people like her husband and, it seemed, by people like the woman now sitting on my sofa, kept growing. I asked the question that had been echoing in my head since Jennifer's visit, the one that made no sense even when you held it up to the light, from 10 different angles, and Agent Chen answered it with a kind of grim respect, saying that Marcus scattered Sarah's data like seed, not to hoard value, but to kill the profit motive, sending complete research packets to universities, clinics, and open repositories around the world, so that what was once a single treasure guarded by gates became 1,000 gardens no one could fence, and in doing so, he made it impossible for any single actor to own the cure his wife had died to deliver, which closed one door for the people circling the work and opened another, darker door marked revenge, deterrence, and unfinished business. The story did not end with publication. It metastasized into credible threats, messages that never used the word kill, yet promised an ending all the same. Photographs taken from too near a schoolyard, a courier envelope with nothing inside but a child's bracelet identical to one Emily had stopped wearing, and although some of it could be dismissed as coincidence or the paranoia of grief, Marcus is not a man who confuses caution with fear, so he vanished without leaving, stepping sideways into the invisibility that service uniforms provide, remaining close to power centers where information flows like current and where a man who listens can hear the hum behind the walls. And he did all of this in a city where people look at the hands that bring them things and not at the eyes that see them. James watched me closely as Agent Chen spoke, perhaps bracing for denial or outrage or collapse. But I felt something harder and colder take shape inside me, an alloy of guilt and clarity, because the truth was as simple as it was unbearable. I had pulled a thread he had deliberately tucked away. I had lit a flare he had carefully avoided. And whatever I wanted to believe about my intentions did not matter nearly as much as the exposure my invitation had created. So when Agent Chen asked whether Marcus had said anything that sounded like a safety plan, a rendezvous point, a code word, a contingency, I could only shake my head and confess that I had been too busy performing benevolence to notice the vocabulary of vigilance. She didn't scold me. She nodded like someone filing an inconvenient fact, and then began asking for the ordinary details that become critical in extraordinary moments. What time he arrived, which elevator he used, how long he stayed near the windows, whether he seemed to scan exits, whether anyone in the room approached him with the aggression of recognition. And as I answered piece by piece, I felt the night reassemble itself, not as a party, but as a map of decisions, mine and his and everyone else's, until even the shattered champagne flute in the corner looked like punctuation in a sentence that had been trying to warn me where it would end. The room went quiet for a breath, that long-held moment when everyone feels a shift, but cannot yet name it, and then my phone began to vibrate again, a sound I had come to dread. And I glanced at the screen expecting another headline, another question, another reminder that the story had left my hands. But the name that glowed there did not belong to a journalist or a colleague or a curious friend. It belonged to the center of the storm I had invited into the light, and for a second I could not move, because the weight of the call felt heavier than any diamond I had ever fastened around my neck. Agent Chen gestured for me to answer, and toggled a small recorder with the unshowy grace of someone who resists drama, because truth makes enough of its own. And I pressed accept and lifted the phone, feeling as if the edges of the city had shifted to listen with me. And when I said hello, the voice that came through the line was familiar yet transformed, its warmth tempered by iron, its calm edged by purpose, the sound of a man who had spent 3 years turning love into discipline and grief into design. "Miss Hamilton, this is Marcus Thompson." He paused, as if to let the name settle where the room could not deny it. His voice is calm and utterly different. He wasn't waiting to be rescued. He was calling the shots. For a moment after his voice filled the room, none of us spoke. Even Agent Chen, who seemed trained to breathe calmly in crisis, froze with her pen half lifted above her notepad. The silence was alive with the static of everything unspoken. The guilt beating inside my chest, the authority she represented, and the strange, commanding steadiness of Marcus Thompson on the other end of the line. "Miss Hamilton," he repeated, his tone so composed it sounded almost unreal. "I need to thank you for last night. Emily had a wonderful time." I managed a faint, stunned reply. "Marcus." But before I could form another word, Agent Chen gestured sharply, mouthing "keep him talking," while she switched her phone to speaker and activated a recorder. "Marcus, this is Agent Sarah Chen with the FBI," she said smoothly, her professionalism sliding back into place. "We have credible intelligence suggesting your location has been compromised. For your safety and your daughter's, we need to move you immediately." The line was quiet for a heartbeat. And then came the sound of Marcus's low, controlled laughter. It wasn't mocking, exactly. It was the kind of laugh that belongs to someone who's already solved a problem everyone else is just beginning to see. "Agent Chen," he said, "I've known about your surveillance for 3 years. You're not the first to track me, and you won't be the last. But you're mistaken if you think last night was an accident. It was the right moment." "The right moment for what?" she asked. "For the end of hiding." His words landed with the weight of inevitability. I stared at the phone in my hand, realizing that while we'd spent the morning trying to assemble his story, Marcus had been living 3 years ahead of it. "Mr. Thompson," Chen continued, her voice crisp, but now edged with urgency. "You and your daughter are under imminent threat. These people won't hesitate if they believe you're exposing them. We can get you to a secure facility in—" "Agent Chen," Marcus interrupted, not sharply, but with finality. "Emily and I have been preparing for this longer than you've been watching. I built safety into every step we've taken. You move when you must. We move when we're ready." Chen exchanged a glance with James, who looked equally bewildered and awed. She tried again. "You're not equipped to handle what's coming." "On the contrary," Marcus replied, "I've been handling it since the night my wife died." His tone softened slightly. "You think I've been hiding in fear. But fear isn't what keeps you alive for 3 years, under the eyes of men who think they own the world. Planning does." I could hear faint keystrokes and the hum of electronics in the background. Proof that he wasn't calling from a hotel or some safe house, but from a place wired, deliberate, and alive with purpose. "Marcus," James said carefully, stepping closer to the phone, "what are you planning?" "A correction," Marcus answered. "For 3 years I've been collecting what your courts and committees couldn't touch. Financial records, encrypted communications, transaction trails, testimony from witnesses too terrified to speak before. I've built a case strong enough to survive even my death, and I'm done waiting for permission to use it." Agent Chen straightened. "You're saying you've conducted your own investigation?" "I'm saying," he replied evenly, "that the Thompson Foundation never stopped operating. It simply changed form. We went from funding hospitals and schools to charting the arteries of corruption that bled them dry. Every dollar that killed Sarah's research left a trace. Every threat against Emily left a fingerprint, and now the entire ecosystem is mapped." The room seemed to shrink around us. I could feel the tremor of realization in the air. Marcus wasn't a victim emerging from hiding. He was the architect of something vast, something that had quietly grown roots while the world assumed he was gone. Chen spoke again, more cautiously now. "If that's true, Mr. Thompson, then we need to align our efforts. We can coordinate warrants, protection, jurisdiction." "No," he said. "This isn't coordination. It's conclusion. At noon, you'll come to the Thompson Foundation headquarters. Alone. Bring Miss Hamilton with you." The request hit like a slap. I looked at Chen, expecting refusal, but Marcus's tone made refusal sound like folly. "That building's been empty for 3 years," she said. "Has it?" Marcus's voice carried a flicker of amusement. "Your surveillance saw what I allowed it to see. Noon, Agent Chen. Bring her. There are things she deserves to understand." The line went dead. The silence that followed felt like the aftermath of an explosion. No noise, only pressure. For a few long seconds, we just stood there, 3 people in a penthouse filled with the faint hum of electronics and the heavy echo of revelation. James was the first to speak, his voice low. He's been controlling the board all along. Agent Chen began issuing quiet instructions into her radio, words like teams, containment, coordinates. Her movements were precise, but I could see the flicker of something that might have been admiration or fear. "He's not running from us," she murmured. "He's pulling us into position." I sat down slowly, the edge of the couch cool beneath my shaking hands. The man I had mocked, the man I thought I'd invited as a spectacle, had spent 3 years constructing an invisible empire of truth beneath the surface of the city I thought I ruled. Chen ended her call and turned to me. "We'll go," she said quietly. "No backup? No team? If he's serious, we'll need to know what he's built before anyone else interferes." "What if it's a trap?" I asked. "Then it's one he's been building for years," she said. "But he's not calling us into danger. He's calling us into his plan." I looked toward the window, where morning light spilled across the skyline, touching the glass towers that had always symbolized control to me. But now, for the first time, they looked like chess pieces. Glittering, fragile, waiting to be moved. If he's right, the building everyone thought was dark is about to light up. Behind the blank glass, a war room waited. From the street, the Thompson Foundation headquarters looked exactly as I remembered it. An immaculate mausoleum of glass and steel, its reflective facade hiding what I assumed was nothing more than dust, darkness, and disuse. For 3 years, it had been written off as another casualty of tragedy, its lights extinguished, its silence mistaken for decay. But as Agent Chen and I stepped through the revolving doors, the illusion shattered instantly. The marble floors gleamed, so clean they mirrored our movements, and the air hummed with the quiet vibration of hidden systems, security, data, surveillance, alive beneath the surface. This wasn't abandonment. It was camouflage. The front desk, unmanned but immaculate, bore a subtle indentation from years of use, and beyond it, a pattern of cameras blinked almost imperceptibly. Someone had been watching, cataloging, preparing. Chen scanned the space instinctively, her hand resting near her sidearm, her every step measured. "This place was supposed to be shut down," she murmured. "No utilities, no registered staff." "Appearances," I whispered, realizing that everything Marcus had done, every piece of this stage, was deliberate theater. He hadn't vanished into darkness. He had built an operation inside it. Before Chen could respond, the center elevator chimed, softly, and its doors parted with surgical precision. Marcus stood inside, hands clasped loosely in front of him, the kind of calm that doesn't need to be performed. Gone was the affable guest from my party. This version of him radiated command. His charcoal suit was replaced by black, sleek, unadorned, functional, and his eyes carried the kind of focus that comes from knowing the plan extends beyond everyone else's imagination. "Agent Chen, Miss Hamilton," he greeted, his tone formal but not cold. "Thank you for coming." The elevator ride was silent except for the quiet hum of motion, the floor counter ticking upward with mechanical efficiency. Chen studied him openly, but Marcus didn't flinch beneath the scrutiny. The man who had fixed light fixtures in my building now moved with the assurance of someone accustomed to boardrooms and battlefields alike. When the doors opened again, the scene that greeted us made me inhale sharply. The top floor of the supposedly dormant building was alive with controlled activity. The vast open space had been transformed into a command center, rows of workstations lit by the glow of high-resolution displays, each screen alive with data streams, encrypted communications, and what looked like financial forensics spanning continents. Large boards mounted on the walls bore names, timelines, and intricate webs of connections marked with red thread and annotation. maps of corruption rendered in light and ink. The air itself seemed to hum with purpose, the atmosphere dense with intention. "This," Marcus said, sweeping an arm across the room, "is what's left of the Thompson Foundation. Not the version that gives charity galas and press statements, the real one. For the past 3 years, every grant, every donation, every field project has doubled as a front for investigation. We've traced the money that killed Sarah." He gestured toward one of the central boards. I stepped closer and saw what looked like a sprawling corporate tree. Pharmaceutical giants branching into shell companies, offshore accounts, political PACs, and consulting firms. Threads of digital red connected them in an intricate pattern of deceit. "Sarah's work was revolutionary," he continued. "Her protocol reduced the cost of pediatric cancer treatment by nearly 80%. It didn't just threaten profits, it threatened control. They could not afford to let her finish." Chen moved toward the display, her eyes scanning the digital trails. "Who are they?" she asked. "A consortium," Marcus said evenly. "A partnership between manufacturers, investors, and policy lobbyists. The people who decide who gets sick and who gets cured. They made one mistake." "And what was that?" Chen asked. "They underestimated what love can do when it's cornered." His words filled the room with quiet electricity. He turned to another station, where screens displayed lines of code and financial documents. Every transfer, every meeting, every order. "We've cataloged it all. Emails, encrypted communications, bank movements. The evidence is complete. I spent 3 years building a case that no court in the world could suppress. If something happens to me, this data is automatically released to international press, government archives, and humanitarian networks across 12 countries. The moment I stop breathing, they stop hiding." Chen looked at him sharply. "You've created a dead man switch." Marcus nodded. "I prefer to think of it as a guarantee of accountability." As if on cue, one of the analysts stationed near the far end of the room turned from a console. "Sir," he said, "confirmation from our contacts. Hostile activity in the city. 3 teams. They're setting up around known associates." Marcus barely blinked. "Let them. They've been waiting 3 years for me to surface. Now finally they'll come into the open." I felt my pulse climb. "Marcus, this is madness. You're telling them where to find you." He turned toward me, and for a moment his expression softened. Not condescending, not pitying, just human. "No, Victoria, I'm showing them they've already lost. You were the light they didn't expect. The moment my story touched the public, they could no longer erase it. You didn't make a mistake. You gave me visibility, and they can't kill what the world is watching." I tried to speak, but words failed me. There was something terrifyingly steady about him, something absolute. He wasn't reckless. He was resolved. Chen, ever the professional, had already resumed her questioning. "You said the people behind this will come for you. What's your endgame, Mr. Thompson? What do you plan to do when they arrive?" Marcus's gaze moved to the large glass wall overlooking the city. The skyline glittered beneath the mid-morning light, towers gleaming like chess pieces poised for play. "Endgame?" he repeated softly. "I don't believe in endings, Agent Chen. Only exposure. You can't destroy darkness, but you can drown it in light." He glanced toward one of the technicians. "Activate sequence 1. A low hum filled the room. Screens blinked, new data populating across maps and feeds. Chen tensed, ready to demand clarification, but Marcus spoke first. "You asked my endgame," he said quietly. "You're standing in it. Everything I've built is already in motion." He turned back toward us, and for the first time, I saw something flicker in his eyes. A mixture of grief and purpose, so fused it was indistinguishable. "By sunset," he said, "every secret they've buried will surface, every account, every order, every name, and there's nothing they can do to stop it." A nearby clock began to tick audibly, a countdown flashing across one of the larger monitors. Agent Chen asks his endgame. His answer is a clock that starts now. For 3 years, they hunted a ghost. Tonight, the ghost would speak. By late afternoon, the Thompson Foundation headquarters felt like a living organism. Every screen pulsing with data, every voice calibrated to efficiency. The hum of purpose had turned into something sharper, more electric, as Marcus finalized details that could either save or destroy everything he had built. He moved through the space like a conductor guiding a silent symphony, precise and deliberate, every gesture rippling outward through the room. When he finally turned toward us, there was no hesitation in his voice. 6 p.m., he said. The Meridian Hotel Grand Ballroom. That's when it ends. Agent Chen frowned, checking her watch. You're giving them less than 4 hours. Exactly, Marcus replied. It's enough time for them to panic and not enough time to regroup. The clarity of his tone chilled me. He wasn't improvising. He was executing something that had been planned down to the minute. Every detail, location, timing, sequence, was surgical. He outlined his objective with a precision that reminded me of boardroom presentations, except the stakes were now measured in lives and justice instead of profit margins. At 6 o'clock, the Foundation will host a press conference. Every major media outlet is already alerted. We'll release the full dossier, financial transfers, communication logs, witness affidavits. At that same moment, the FBI and international agencies will receive synchronized data drops. By the time the first headline hits, the arrests will already be in progress. Chen nodded slowly, her professional skepticism melting into cautious respect. And if they move on you before that? Marcus smiled faintly. Then they'll be moving on the wrong me. The words hung there like smoke. What do you mean? I asked. I've spent 3 years teaching them to underestimate me, he said. Every time they thought they had a lead, it was one I left for them to find. They'll think I'm exactly where they expect me to be, standing at a podium, vulnerable, exposed. He looked up at the screens, which displayed looping security feeds and mirrored data sets. But I'll only be there on their terms long enough to make sure they act. The real operation happens beneath the surface. Agent Chen exhaled slowly. You're baiting them. I'm inviting them, Marcus corrected, to reveal themselves. He turned back to the monitors, adjusting timelines and encryption triggers. His every movement radiated calm control, but I could feel the tension coiling beneath it, an invisible clock ticking toward 6. I wanted to speak, to apologize again for the part I had played in this cascade of events, but the words felt useless. When I finally managed to say, I never meant to expose you, his answer stopped me cold. You didn't expose me, Victoria, he said gently. You activated me. The sentence struck like truth spoken too, late to change anything. For 3 years, Marcus continued, I've been waiting for a reason to step into the light. I needed someone outside the circle of loss, someone who could remind the world that this isn't just about revenge, it's about truth. Your invitation gave me that stage. I looked away, ashamed of the naive arrogance that had led me to mock him in the first place. I'd thought I'd orchestrated a game of social dominance. Instead, I'd helped open the door to a global reckoning. Chen stepped closer to Marcus's central workstation. We'll coordinate field teams and create a protective perimeter. Discreet presence only. No heavy deployment until confirmation of threat movement. Marcus nodded. Your agents will cover the outer perimeter. My people will cover the rest. They know the faces of the consortium's private contractors better than anyone. This will look like routine event security. No disruptions until after the broadcast. On the digital display, the operation unfolded in color-coded grids, entry points, camera positions, data release timers. The press conference wasn't just a statement. It was an engineered exposure designed to trap corruption in its own reflexes. Watching him direct it all, I realized that Marcus's true genius wasn't in his wealth or intellect. It was in his ability to anticipate behavior. He knew his enemies better than they knew themselves. They would come, convinced they could silence him again. They would expect chaos, fear, retreat. Instead, they'd meet order, evidence, and cameras. Still, guilt gnawed at me. And Emily? I asked softly. Where is she during all this? Marcus paused, his hands resting on the edge of the console. The flickering monitors painted his face in alternating light and shadow. Safe, he said. For now. Chen arched a brow. For now. He gave a faint, unreadable smile. Emily knows why her mother's work matters. But justice without Sarah's name attached isn't justice. It's bureaucracy. She'll be there when the truth is spoken. She deserves to hear it firsthand. The air went still. Even Chen hesitated before responding. You're bringing your daughter to a live event where your enemies are likely to make a move? Marcus's gaze hardened. They've already taken her mother. They won't take her courage too. There was no arguing with the conviction in his tone. It wasn't recklessness. It was legacy. As the final hour drew closer, the operation shifted gears. Agents moved like ghosts through hotel schematics. Private security integrated seamlessly with FBI tactical units, and every path in or out of the Meridian was mapped, logged, and monitored. Marcus's internal network synchronized with law enforcement servers under Chen's supervision. The plan was airtight, on paper. But beneath the order, danger pulsed like a live wire. I walked to the panoramic window overlooking the skyline. The late afternoon sun burned gold against the glass towers, casting long shadows that felt like omens. Marcus, I said quietly, you've been building this trap for 3 years. Are you sure you want to spring it tonight? He joined me, his reflection sharp and steady beside mine. It isn't about wanting, he said. It's about finishing. Sarah believed knowledge only matters when it's shared. Tonight, her voice is shared through mine, and through Emily's. The last words tightened my throat. I watched as he straightened his tie, checked his watch, and issued final commands to his team with unflinching calm. Outside, the city moved obliviously, unaware that the balance of truth and deceit was about to shift. Emily is en route, because truth without her mother's name isn't justice. Justice doesn't whisper when it has receipts. The Meridian Grand Ballroom didn't feel like a hotel anymore. It felt like a control room for history. Walls of screens lined the back of the hall, cables snaked under velvet drapes, and camera lights burned like artificial suns. What had once hosted charity galas and luxury brand launches now pulsed with something entirely different. Anticipation sharpened into purpose. Marcus had turned a ballroom into a broadcast arena. I stood near the edge of the stage, my name not on any roster, but my heart wired into every second of what was about to unfold. Around me, journalists adjusted their cameras, technicians whispered into headsets, and security, both federal and private, moved like shadows. The room smelled faintly of ozone and nerves. Agent Chen's voice came through her earpiece, low and steady, but carrying the urgency of incoming weather. We've confirmed hostile teams in 3 buildings within visual range. They're not moving yet, but the timing lines up with the broadcast window. Marcus didn't flinch. Then they'll get the front row seat they paid for. His calm wasn't defiance. It was orchestration. Every step, every risk, had been built into the rhythm of his plan. At 5:40, Emily arrived. She was a vision in pale blue, her hair pinned neatly back, a small pendant at her throat glinting under the lights. The chaos around her seemed to hush as she entered, her presence cutting through the machinery of preparation with something quieter but infinitely stronger: grace. Marcus met her halfway, bending slightly to her level. "Are you ready?" he asked softly. She nodded, her small hand finding his. "You said we're telling the truth for Mommy." "Yes," he replied, his voice breaking for the first time that day. "And for everyone who tried to silence her." It wasn't the tone of a strategist now. It was the voice of a father who had walked through fire to build his daughter a safer world. By 6 p.m., the air had changed. The cameras turned, the lights steadied, and the world, for the first time in 3 years, saw Marcus Thompson step to a podium not as a vanished philanthropist or a mysterious recluse, but as a man bringing light to rot. He began without flourish. 3 years ago, he said, his voice carrying through every microphone, my wife, Dr. Sarah Thompson, was murdered because her research threatened profits measured in billions. Tonight, her work returns to the people it was meant to save. The first slide appeared behind him. Corporate logos, bank names, coded emails unraveling into human language. 17 companies, Marcus continued. 43 individuals, 4 continents. A consortium of power built on the quiet exploitation of disease. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Truth delivered with clarity makes its own echo. As he spoke, the screens around the ballroom flickered to life with live feeds. Courthouse steps in London, corporate offices in Zurich, an airfield in Singapore. FBI and Interpol units were moving simultaneously, executing the warrants timed to his speech. Each name he mentioned triggered a new alert, a new arrest, another fracture in the empire that had believed itself untouchable. Agent Chen stood near the rear wall, issuing near-silent orders through her comm. She didn't need to stop him anymore. She was helping him finish what she once came to control. Then came the reveal that silenced even the most hardened reporters. Marcus opened a small, encrypted console on the podium and placed his hand on a biometric scanner. The overhead monitors filled with cascading streams of data, scientific formulas, lab notes, diagrams, all tagged with the name Dr. Sarah Thompson. This, Marcus said quietly, is her legacy, and as of this moment, it belongs to the world. A ripple went through the crowd as journalists realized what they were seeing. He wasn't just exposing corruption, he was liberating knowledge. Sarah's life's work, the cure they'd tried to bury, was now being transmitted to medical institutions worldwide in real time. Then he lifted his gaze directly to the main broadcast camera, his expression steady, the soft tremor of vengeance transformed into justice. To the people who killed her, he said, you're too late. The line hit like thunder. In the corner of my vision, Agent Chen received a coded nod from one of her agents. It was happening. The arrests were confirmed. Within minutes, news feeds began to light up on the press monitors, headlines forming live, anchors breaking stories mid-broadcast. The ballroom itself became part of the transmission, a global pulse of revelation. Marcus stepped back from the podium as the room erupted. Reporters shouted questions, flashbulbs burst like lightning, and the symphony of justice played at full volume. But he didn't flinch. He turned instead to Emily, who had been standing near the edge of the stage, watching every second with the unblinking gravity only a child of loss can hold. He knelt beside her. The cameras caught it. The moment the entire world saw not just a man exposing power, but a father anchoring his daughter to truth. Emily's hand touched his shoulder, and her voice, soft but unwavering, carried over the noise. Now Mommy can rest. Something broke open in me. For the first time since that night at my penthouse, I felt the enormity of what I had stumbled into. Not a scandal, not even a redemption arc, but a revolution of conscience. Flashbulbs strobed, questions blurred, and the ballroom filled with the sound of a world finally paying attention. But I saw something else. A faint signal blinking on one of Marcus's devices, a red light pulsing near the corner of the console. As cameras flash, Emily looks up at me and says, "Now Mommy can rest." But one last reveal remains. He lived invisible to keep a promise, and became unforgettable by keeping it. The night after the press conference, New York didn't sleep. Screens glowed in apartment windows, news anchors' voices echoed down quiet hallways, and headlines updated by the minute as the full scope of Marcus Thompson's revelation rippled outward. What began as a single broadcast had become a global reckoning. 17 companies, some household names, were collapsing under the weight of their own greed. Executives were detained at airports, financial officers were escorted from offices, and government officials scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. The markets convulsed like something wounded. The same stock tickers that once measured power now displayed freefall. And through it all, one truth stood unshakable. The story could no longer be buried. Marcus's network had seen to that. His encrypted data packets, preloaded, time-released, and mirrored across hundreds of servers, had detonated in digital unison, flooding news outlets, government databases, and non-profit archives with thousands of pages of evidence. There was no one to silence anymore. The record lived everywhere and nowhere at once, immune to deletion, immortalized in transparency. By dawn, law enforcement agencies in 12 countries had confirmed the arrests. The Foundation's press release, automatically scheduled to drop 2 hours after the conference, named not only the guilty, but the innocent too. Whistleblowers, researchers, and victims who had spent years unheard, their reputations tarnished by the very corporations that profited from their silence. Marcus had built a system not just to expose injustice, but to restore truth to those who'd been erased. The world was awake now. I watched the coverage from my apartment, the same space where this story had begun. My penthouse, my pride, my stage. Except now it felt smaller, the chandeliers suddenly ostentatious, the view outside no longer a symbol of arrival, but a reminder of blindness. The woman who had once believed herself a gatekeeper of prestige had been reduced to a single, sobering fact. I had almost turned a man's tragedy into entertainment. Reporters tried to reach me that morning. They wanted statements, commentary, a quote to stitch into their timeline of events. But I declined every call. For the first time in years, I didn't want to manage perception. I wanted to understand it. By midday, I wrote my own public note, not to the press, but to the truth. I described how bias hides behind politeness, how arrogance dresses itself in elegance, and how the most dangerous form of ignorance is the one that smiles while dismissing others. I told the story of the invitation I sent, the laughter it was meant to provoke, and the mirror it became when Marcus walked through my door. I didn't write it for redemption. I wrote it because silence had been the weapon of too many powerful people already. The response shocked me. Thousands of messages arrived within hours. Not all kind, but many from people who admitted they'd done the same thing in smaller ways. Underestimated, misjudged, looked past the quiet worker or the stranger who didn't fit their frame of worth. Marcus had shown the world what hidden greatness looked like. I was simply one of the first to confess how blind we'd been to it. Meanwhile, Emily's face was everywhere. Her photograph from the conference, hand in hand with her father, became the image of vindication. Commentators called her the child who carried the calm of justice. She wasn't interviewed. Marcus refused every request for her privacy. She deserves a childhood, he told one network before vanishing again. This time, not in fear, but in peaceful anonymity. Agent Chen briefed the media once more, confirming that the FBI, Interpol, and European agencies were now jointly managing prosecutions. The investigation would take years, she admitted, but the Foundation had already done the heavy lifting. Mr. Thompson's evidence is airtight, she said. He built a better case than we ever could. It was the rare moment when law enforcement spoke with awe instead of authority. That evening, as twilight washed the city in amber and blue, I returned to the Meridian Ballroom, now silent and empty again. The scent of cables and adrenaline had been replaced by the faint trace of flowers from a private memorial someone had left near the podium. I stood where Marcus had spoken, and imagined the sound of his voice filling the space once more. Steady, unyielding, carrying not rage but resolution. Power, I realized, had never lived in chandeliers or corner offices. It lived in courage welded to proof, in the quiet defiance of someone who refuses to be erased. Marcus hadn't fought with fury. He'd fought with evidence, patience, and unflinching love. His war had no victims, only witnesses, millions of them now awake. As I left the ballroom, the city below felt different. The skyline no longer looked like competition. It looked like conscience. For every light that flickered in a penthouse window, I wondered how many others were hiding stories like his, truths waiting for the one moment they'd finally matter. In the following weeks, the Thompson Foundation re-emerged, not as an empire of wealth, but as a network for accountability. Anonymous donors fueled new initiatives in ethics, transparency, and open access medicine. Its leadership was rumored to include some of the very whistleblowers Marcus had protected. Whether he remained involved, no one could say. He had disappeared again, this time by choice, his mission complete. Emily, now enrolled quietly in a new school under an assumed name, sent me a handwritten note through Agent Chen. It said only this: "Daddy says heroes don't live in stories. They live in what we fix after the story ends." I held that letter for a long time, its neat handwriting trembling slightly in ink. I'd spent my entire life chasing recognition, and yet the man I'd once invited as a joke had changed the world precisely because he didn't seek it. Marcus Thompson kept his promise, to his wife, to his daughter, to truth itself. He lived invisible so that others could finally be seen. And in doing so, he became unforgettable. As I closed the letter and looked out over the city that had once been my kingdom, I understood the final paradox of power. It doesn't come from being admired. It comes from being right when it costs you everything. I once thought I invited a maintenance worker as a joke. The man who walked in rewired the world, and the way I will ever see it again. If this story moved you, don't just scroll away. Share it with someone who still believes appearances tell the whole story. Hit that like button if you believe truth always finds its light, and subscribe for more real, emotional stories that reveal what people hide behind everyday faces. Drop a comment below and tell me, what would you have done if you were in Victoria's place? Because sometimes one choice doesn't just change a life, it rewrites it.